know that you are in for a very lovely evening. So let me introduce myself. My name is Asha Melbauer. I'm a faculty member in the Department of English, but I also direct the Exiled Studies program that I founded 5 years ago. A program, as you see by the number of people that show up, is flourishing and is doing well. We have the only certificate program in the country and probably in the world, and I take a disclaimer on that, but everywhere I searched or conferences I went, there is nowhere a curricular program established where you can get a certificate in Exiled Studies. And already here we have a number of people who got certificates in Exiled Studies. Some of them are now graduate program, some are in PhD programs, so they are doing well. And I'm glad that we have established that program because it is growing and it is taking on steam and it's going places. It's an 18-credit program, I'm telling you this not to sell it, just to let you know what is happening. It's an 18 credits program, it's anchored in the English department, and I also have to add while I'm on the English department issue that it probably would not have happened if I did not have the kind of support that was extended by the Department of English, especially by our chair, Dr. Sutton here, who was with the program all the time. And again, while I'm now on Dr. Sutton's case, he will give a major lecture on Shakespeare in Exile on February the 8th as part of the Shakespeare Folio project that he is organizing now. So today's lecture is the 5th lecture that we have established together with the Betsy Hotel, and it is titled the Betsy FIU Exiled Studies Scholar / Writer in Residence. Our first resident at Betsy was Chen Hovey. Unfortunately, he passed away not long ago, a Zimbabwean writer who was kicked out of Zimbabwe and found a place in Europe, and he was invited to come at the Betsy. I'll tell you more about it in a minute. We also had Guy Stern, a refugee from Germany, the former provost of Wayne State University and a major scholar and founder of Exiled Studies. We have Norman Mania, a very important American Romanian writer who is at Bard College that for a long time served as a place of refuge. And we have actually the president of Bard College, Leon Goldstein, who talked about the academe and exile. And today, of course, we have Professor Holly Levitsky from Loyola University. She will be introduced by Dr. Evelyn Geiser in a few minutes. I don't want to take too much time to give an introduction, but I still have to acknowledge those who have been supporting the Exiled Studies program and who have contributed handsomely in many different ways to the program and to the kind of elements that we have now. So we have a certificate, as I told you. We have the Betsy FIU residence program. We have another program going, which is our Exilic Conversations, where we bring together fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, and they have a conversation, intergenerational kind of experience exchanges. And of course, we have lecture series like Exile and Totalitarianism, Exile and Creativity, and many other things. And what we are proud also of is that our program, or these kinds of activities, also include not only faculty or invited visiting faculty from other universities, but also our own students. So as they mature, they give their own papers, participate in the programs. We had a colloquium with the participation of students dealing with the burdens and joys of inheritance. And it was a wonderful program. And 2 of these students are now in graduate school. So we are doing something good together with other programs in collaboration. But I am very proud of the program that we have established with the Betsy Hotel, which today is really an institution. You can think of of another institution in the city that had taken on the kind of prominence that Betsy has taken on, and that's Books and Books probably in Coral Gables, but they are much older in a way. And Betsy has been here, I don't remember, for 6, 7, 8 years, but it has become an institution, a real cultural center where people congregate to celebrate the arts, celebrate humanity, and celebrate those who sometimes find themselves beyond the normal, so to speak, the exiles. And we have enjoyed that kind of a relationship for some time. We have Dr. Deborah Platzik here, Dr. Deborah Briggs here, who is probably the engine behind all the activities that are taking place at the Betsy, as well as beyond Betsy, because they are involved in so many different projects around the city, especially those that have to do with art and education. And Dr. Briggs' brother Jonathan Platzik, and the family in general, they have been very generous to us in many different ways and promote what we are suggesting to them as something valuable from an academic point of view. So, Dr. Briggs, I'm really very, very thankful for everything that you are doing for us. And of course, I have to acknowledge Arts and Sciences, the College of Arts and Sciences, and as well as SEAS, the School of Environment and the Arts and Humanities, that Dr. Evelyn Geiser is the executive director of that school, and she has been wonderful to us in supporting us, along with English, the Center for the Humanities in Urban Environment, and we also have for today's lecture, and as well as for the panel that we will have with Dr. Levitsky on Thursday, we also have the support of the Latin American Caribbean Center, the SIPA, the School of International Public Affairs Business. We stitch together things, and it's wonderful because what we need to do is to create the interdisciplinarity and the complementarity of the disciplines. That's how we learn really well. I also am really thankful to the Cuban Research Institute that is also supporting us in our panel on Thursday, as well as our Graduate English Association, the Honor Society, Sigma Tau Delta, and my students, because it is all for them, basically. I know about Exiled a great deal and lived that kind of experience, so there is hardly anything new I can learn except for what Dr. Holly Levitsky will tell me today. But for the students, some of it is new, some of it confirms what they already know from their own experiences. But mostly, we are initiating them into this kind of a milieu, into an intellectual milieu, because it's not by bread alone. They work during daytime, they come in the evening, and they want to be here, and they are spiritually nourished, and they remember it for many years to come. And then there are also faculty like Dr. Schwartz, Dr. Sutton, Dr. Ken Johnson, and many others who come out and support us. And of special thanks is also our personal friends like Dr. Gottlieb, who is here. Mrs. Gottlieb couldn't be here, who have been coming to these lectures for a long time and supporting us again in many different ways. And then former students who teach for us, like Roberto Herrera here and others. So my heart is full of thanks. I cannot remember everyone, but I'm grateful to everyone who is here today. So what I want to do now is to have Dr. Briggs from the Betsy Hotel welcome you here and tell you a little bit more about the Betsy and the cooperation that we have. And then Dr. Evelyn Geiser will tell you about our enterprise as a large academic enterprise, and also introduce Professor Holly Levitsky. Okay? Enjoy the evening, Dr. Briggs.
Good evening. Good evening. It's wonderful to be here this evening. I'm bringing you greetings on behalf of my whole team from the Betsy and my brother and his wife who own the Betsy. It's been our pleasure to work with FIU. Just to tell a personal story, I met Dr. Sutton through one of his instructors world is a small place. I met her somewhere and she said, you have to meet Dr. Sutton. I had a meeting with Dr. Sutton, he said, you have to meet Dr. Milbauer. And so that's the way it ensued. When I heard about the Exiled Studies program, I just was fascinated by it. I was fascinated with what I thought it was when we first got together, and then when Dr. Milbauer started talking about dimensions of exile I had never thought about, and that it was such a deep topic. We knew then that it was something we really wanted to engage in. What we do at the Betsy is to try to find spaces that other institutions might not yet be addressing. Because there's really no need to do something over again someone else is doing. So, this was an area, because we enjoy having artists in residence and thought leaders visit, that we thought we could bring something to the community by embracing. So we're delighted to have taken this journey with Dr. Milbauer and Dr. Sutton, and the Department of English, and so many, and to have touched so many students together. It's really a thrill to be here tonight with Dr. Levitsky, because we're also celebrating 6 years of partnership with the Jewish American Holocaust Literature Conference, which is something Dr. Levitsky has been leading for many years. And so this week we're celebrating Jewish literature in addition to exile literature here. And so Dr. Levitsky will be staying in the Betsy Writers Room later in the week. And that's a room where we invite thought leaders to come to the community and meet constituents in Miami, again, to share ideas about things that matter. So again, it's a pleasure to be here. We're really proud to be involved, and I'm looking forward to enjoying the evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Briggs, and it's so wonderful to have such an incredible audience here tonight. That's great. My name is Evelyn Geiser. I'm the executive director of our School of Environment, Arts, and Society at FIU, and I'm welcoming you on behalf of the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. So C, School for Environment, Arts, and Society, is one of the 2 schools within our college. We're really geared around bringing the sciences and the humanities together to create the kind of interdisciplinary environment that's so necessary for us to understand how human and natural systems change and transform over time. And so that's what we attempt to do. We do that through a number of departments. So we have the Department of English, the Department of Biological Sciences, the Department of Earth and Environment, all coming together under that envelope. And we have a number of institutes and centers and programs like the ones that have brought this lecture series about tonight. So the Exiled Studies program, our Center for Humanities and the Urban Environment are co-hosting. And we have a number of other centers and institutes as well, really integrating that environment and humanities theme. And those include our Tropical Conservation Institute, our Institute for, International Center for Tropical Botany, our Institute for Water and the Environment. These are all big interdisciplinary centers that house lots of faculty, graduate students, undergraduate students working in labs, working with faculty on topics that are really important for us as we move forward as a sort of vulnerable area, especially here in Miami, to the kinds of changes that are affecting environmental changes and social changes that are affecting our landscape. So we're really thrilled tonight to have Dr. Levitsky here. She's director and founder of the Jewish Studies program and professor of English at Loyola Marymount University, which is in Los Angeles. So she's come a long way to be here. And as Dr. Briggs said, she's been conducting or leading the special symposium or international conference that's been hosted at the Betsy of the Jewish American Institute. Did I say that right?
Jewish American Holocaust Literature Symposium.
Okay, Holocaust Literature Symposium. So she's really at the head of that discipline and conducts her research and teaches in that field, and has written 3 books, numerous papers, many book chapters on this topic of the Holocaust, and really has been thinking in the area of the Polish Jewish and German Jewish intersections and the interpretation of this history from those different perspectives. So we're so excited to have you here. We're really honored that you are a fellow in the program and able to talk to us tonight. So thank you so much, and thanks again to the Betsy for supporting this program, the resident program, and for hosting this event. So thank you.
I want to thank Dr. Milbauer, Dr. Briggs, Dr. Geiser, and all of you for coming. Also, my lovely dinner companions here. Thank you all. I have some members of my family here too, so it's especially exciting to see students. As Dr. Milbauer said, really that's why we do what we do. If we didn't have you, we wouldn't have a job. And if we're doing our job well, we're addressing what we do to you. The exiled pilgrim, writes Yitzhak Orpaj, carrying with him a curse, an affliction, a mortal sin, does not turn to God in his distress. In the strictest sense of the word, he has no God. He too has fallen by the wayside. A dim, ancient memory of something broken, of vague yearnings, is stored inside him. He does not call it by name, he does not know its name, but he needs it, and he is looking for it. While the particular context for Orpaj's words is his own immigration to Palestine from Soviet Russia in 1938, the idea of the displaced subject as a repository for memories of things broken resonates on a universal level. We are reminded that the displaced person does not simply experience exile as a phenomenon outside of the self, as something affecting or infecting the self. Rather, exile is carried within. It is transported with the self to a new and foreign place. It is experienced as a lens through which the exile understands the new surroundings, a land foreign to the self in culture, custom, language, and location. And, like Orpaj suggests, innate understanding of the exilic defines the exile. It is inescapable and insurmountable. Yet, the exile does not wish to be separate from it because it links to the past. It is part of the identity. The irony, of course, is that the person who experiences the solitariness of exile is not alone. Exile is a dominant theme of our times. It can be found not only in the forced migration of populations, and we certainly are seeing that now, but also in the temporal, cultural, and physical alienation of the individual's experiences of the postmodern world. What I want to explore with you today is the literature of this world of unstable, shifting identities. The stories I have selected examine issues of remembering and forgetting, trauma and nostalgia, time and space, social and sexual exclusion, among others. I want to offer a new perspective on the American immigrant experience, or their narratives, and consider the universality of the exilic experience, as well as the conditions that have precipitated the migration of millions from other countries to the United States. It is my hope that you will gain a greater critical purchase on American narratives of exile and displacement through the works I will discuss. We live in a time of crisis. Political unrest, social and cultural upheavals, economic struggles, military and land conflicts, technology gone awry, historical legacies, psychological breaking points, and bouts of terrorism all contribute to the turbulent undertone of our era. Each new crisis leaves us with a feeling of collective vulnerability, and we often feel compelled to remark on the uniqueness of the event. We forget that the experience of crisis, though it may appear and reappear as a result of vastly different struggles, is neither new nor remarkable in its distinctness. The experience of crisis has long been a factor in identity formation, and literature that explores exile and displacement that result from crises is valuable not only because it allows us to bear witness to the suffering of human beings in a way that will enable us to respond ethically to their needs, but also because it establishes the universality of an experience that transcends time and space. Displacement is a global phenomenon. Regardless of which country we inhabit, we are sure to encounter individuals who have fled a crisis in another country. My primary area of inquiry tonight, however, is the immigration to the United States resulting from terrors and crises around the world. America has long been a place of refuge for those fleeing injustices or seeking new lives and opportunities. For this reason and others, American society is a stronghold for the immigrant position. But while we as a nation have sympathized collectively with the plight of the displaced person, the daily reality of what it means to be an immigrant living in and attempting to assimilate into American culture often reveal few signs of this sympathy. With this in mind, my primary objective is to promote an understanding of the complex issues resulting from exile. Many of these narratives contain thematic similarities, again, reinforcing the belief in the universality of the experience of exile. But I'm also careful to include voices from different parts of the world, because despite the commonalities inherent in all tales of exile, each voice is distinct and must be read as such. My focus on characters exiled from India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Sudan, Iran, Bosnia, Russia, Poland, Lithuania, Greece, Cuba, the Caribbean, Korea, Japan, and China. I know it doesn't seem like we have enough time, but I promise I will talk about all of those. Reveal that attempts at adaptation to the United States in the 20th and 21st centuries are challenging on almost every level. The characters depicted in these stories are faced with new and unfamiliar geographical, cultural, political, and linguistic environments. The narratives that frame these difficult encounters reflect the nuanced challenges that American immigrants face every day. Additional areas of inquiry include issues of remigration, the long-time impact of exile on the next generation, as well as a comparative view of different experiences of exile. And finally, the complexity of dealing simultaneously with trauma and exile. With the unprecedented upheavals of the 20th and early 21st centuries, exile and displacement have become the norm rather than the exception. Contemporary imagination, in turn, has been affected by the narratives of migration and dislocation. Thus, most of the stories I will discuss were written since 1990. All of them, by definition, characterize exile as a source of creativity, while being deeply enmeshed in a history of wars and violence, immigration and colonization. I consider narratives of homecomings alongside narratives of no return, stories of voluntary exile alongside stories of forced displacement. All of them look closely at the concepts of identity, home, language, and memory. Many of the narratives invite an especially complex reading, given that they are generated in the aftermath of various traumas that transpire in the characters' respective countries of origin and are simultaneously contextualized, if only implicitly, in the collective tragedy experienced by Americans in the wake of 9/11. That is to say, some of these selected texts depict characters who, while working through their own traumatic memories, become enmeshed in an American society that is collectively still working through its own traumatic upheavals. As one can imagine, this can create an especially fraught environment for the immigrant, who exists as an outsider in a society that has grown increasingly fearful of the outsider. Many of these writers focus on the complex cultural, racial, and religious issues that surface in the United States, both before and after 9/11. Shayla Abdullah's Saffron Dreams, as my first example, deals specifically with this precarious subject position and paints a vivid picture of Arab and Asian immigrants desperately trying to prove their loyalty to America in its immediate aftermath. Abdullah demonstrates the ways in which this desperation manifests both externally and internally. Restaurant owners frantically erect "God Bless America" signs to avoid discrimination, while men cut their beards and women exchange their hijabs for Western attire. At the same time, these immigrants withdraw into themselves, guilt-ridden with sins they did not commit, and struggling with a new tension, that of feeling the need to hide their ethnic or national identities while being unable or unwilling to untether themselves from their origins. In Khaled Hosseini's The Kite Runner, we see a snapshot of an Afghan father and son living in the Bay Area in California in the 1980s. The story precedes the events of 9/11 by decades, but written in 2003, just a couple of years following that disaster. The story is infused with a kind of literary prescience that can only come from having been written in the specific historical post-9/11. Sorry, I call it 9/11 and 9/11. I lived in Poland for that year, and I never caught the vernacular of what people in the US call it. So I apologize, I alternate back and forth, 9/11, 9/11. But in this story, in this specific 9/11, 9/11 moment, Baba and his son Amir leave everything behind in Kabul. Baba, even years after emigrating, still finds it difficult to adjust to life in America, while Amir, his son, conceives of America as a place to bury his memories. Amir's story, it turns out, is not the only one in which a character feels as if he or she must bury his or her memories in order to survive. And even if only implicitly, the idea of America as a burial place for immigrants' memories is a theme that arises continually. The specific contexts for these selected texts are widely varied, but many of these writers, such as Hosseini and Abdullah, deal not only with the violence that is experienced in their countries of origin, but also the violence or threat of violence that is experienced in America. In Dave Eggers' What is the What, for instance, the young Sudanese man Valentino unwittingly opens his door to two thieves, one of whom brutalizes him to the extent that he wishes he were back in the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, where 80,000 war refugees from Sudan and other countries existed on one meal a day and lived in huts of plastic and sandbags. That he wishes, even if only momentarily, to be back in Kakuma with thousands of refugees who have witnessed violence on a daily basis is chilling. That Valentino, faced with two thieves who have invaded his home, imagines that evil of this kind did not exist in the Kakuma Kakuma refugee camp is a sobering revelation of how painful the transition into a new culture can be for those who have been displaced even when they themselves are fleeing intensely violent and traumatic existences in their countries of origin. And finally, Valentino's impulse to wonder whether cosmological forces had united to chastise him for leaving Africa and dreaming of attending college in America offers crushing insight into the psychological complexity that necessarily contributes to the difficult experience of those in exile. The effects of displacement on women and families carry special consideration. Lourdes Puente, one of the Cuban protagonists of Cristina Garcia's Dreaming in Cuban, patrols the 5-block square of Brooklyn that makes up her beat as an auxiliary policewoman. She prefers to remain vigilant, watching and waiting for miscreants and troublemakers, rather than allow them to surprise her, catch her off guard. Her work shoes are dark, sturdy, and thick-soled, and she reflects on the fact that if women wore such shoes, they wouldn't worry so much about more abstract qualities. Garcia's story confronts the complexity of living as both an immigrant, displaced from one's own culture, and as a woman, which can be tantamount to being displaced within one's own culture. Similarly, Nora Oakja-Keller's Comfort Woman reveals the darker reality of being a woman in a wartime situation and explores the ways in which war often provokes sexual violence against women. Akiko, a young Korean refugee of World War II, involuntarily marries a Christian minister and accompanies him to America. Keller's narrative depicts a reality woven together with dreams. And to Akiko, even America is a country that glitters beautiful like a dream. But it's also a country of excess and extravagance. And while the idea of America is the impetus for many dreams, it also becomes the vehicle that destroys these dreams. For even if America presents a golden landscape, it is also a country where Akiko feels that she has no face, no place. Such is the experience for many of the immigrants encountered in these narratives. Finding a new home does not always resolve the experience of being displaced. Rather, it often exacerbates it or allows the character to feel its textures more poignantly. The sense of perpetual displacement is a theme that is pervasive among these selected texts. Layers of exile inevitably complicate the position of the immigrant. Gary Steingart's The Russian Debutante's Handbook is infused with humor, but despite the comical moments that seem to find Vladimir Gershkin, the 25-year-old Russian protagonist, his job at the Emma Lazarus Immigration Absorption Society, presents us with a landscape littered with displaced people from around the world. And though we laugh, we know that we laugh only in the shadow of both trauma and suffering. Vladimir's job is to help immigrants resolve the many problems they encounter as they attempt to assimilate into a foreign American culture. We are reminded here that finding a new home or a new place does not dissolve the experience of displacement. Rather, it adds another layer to an already immense burden of exile. Like so many of these selections, Steingart's narrative focuses implicitly on how critical it is that the immigrant find a job quickly, that he or she establish a means to become financially independent and learn how to fit him or herself into an American economic framework. Alexander Dumas' Nowhere Man confronts similar issues of the importance of employment and the tragedy of joblessness. The Bosnian narrator, on his way to a job interview, avoids talking with a woman who is friendly with him because he prefers isolation to having to explain that he has no job, or that his last job was smashing boxes in a bookstore. And one of the dominant themes of Andre Dubus III's House of Sand and Fog is the importance of building a financial foundation for one's family. For this narrative's Iranian family living in Northern California, having a job and a home is everything. For without it, the daughter of the family cannot be married to a respectable man from a Persian family. Without a substantial amount of savings, they cannot afford to send their son to university. These are the anxieties that frame many of the stories of immigrant families. For some characters, however, the economic class divide becomes too much to bear. The narrator of Jerzy Kaczynski's Steps, for example, fantasizes about engaging in violent acts against the wealthy, cutting the throats of doormen and slashing through family portraits. He imagines waging war against the city as if it were a living body. The novel Steps does not present a substantial narrative, but it offers a compelling, if chilling, snapshot that characterizes the disparity between economic classes, the lowest of which is often inhabited by the immigrant. Finding employment gives immigrants a means to begin to support themselves financially, but it also enables them to engage with Americans while transitioning into American culture. Many of the characters in these stories, however, find that establishing and maintaining connections with other immigrants or with friends and family from their countries of origin are critical. The structure and function of networking is a common theme. The ability to establish contacts and build collaborations with other exiles, or to remain in contact with sympathetic friends and family in those countries, often proves crucial for survival. These communication networks allow for friendships and collaborations to overcome the separation and isolation caused by exile. For example, in Yufa Lahiri's Mrs. Sen's happiness depends largely on the extent to which she is able to communicate with her family in India. But over time, and with the death of her grandfather, she begins to feel disconnected from them. And we watch as the less equipped she becomes in navigating the difficulties of a new society, the more disconnected she becomes from her network at home. Similarly, young Anya in Santa Krasikov's One More Year works as a dishwasher in a restaurant where other immigrants are also employed, but none of them are Russian like her. Though certainly immigrants face similar challenges despite their places of origin, Anya believes she has little in common with the immigrants from Guatemala and Ecuador, and as a result, she experiences a perpetual sense of loneliness. She feels isolated even among a community of isolated people. Many of these stories depict a similar phenomenon of feeling alone, even when an immigrant is part of a community of other immigrants. The opportunity to engage and interact with others who share one's history and culture is vital. Often, a story's style of writing suggests this implicitly. In Dubus III's House of Sand and Fog, the narrator refers to his co-workers as the Chinese, the Panamanians, and the Vietnamese. He feels no kinship with these other outsiders. As I said earlier, most of these selections I chose are rather contemporary. But exceptions include Upton Sinclair's The Jungle and Ansia Yeziersko's The Breadgivers, both of which reveal some of the darker realities of the immigrant experience in the 1920s. Both of these narratives reveal the squalor of tenement life and the impact that abject poverty has on both the internal and external lives of immigrants. In doing so, they become social and political commentaries that sharply critique the discrepancies between those who have and those who have not. I'm including these classic narratives of displacement in America because they're crucial for a number of reasons, but primarily because juxtaposed against the more contemporary narratives, they reveal the extent to which little has changed for the immigrant, even though nearly 100 years have passed in some instances. The difficulties experienced by those in exile transcend time and space. And while the details of the stories may change, the thrust of the narrative remains constant. Suisin Farr's Mrs. Spring Fragrance is also set in the early 20th century and vividly depicts how immigrants are often at the mercy of seemingly arbitrary laws and regulations. The Chinese immigrant couple in the story decides that the wife should return temporarily to China to give birth to their son in their homeland. When she returns to America without the proper papers for their son, he is taken from them for 10 months and cared for by missionaries. While the story ends somewhat happily in that the parents are, after many letters and the exchanges of money and valuables, reunited with their small son, it is a bittersweet moment because the child no longer feels a connection to his parents. The impact of the experience of exile on family dynamics is showcased in many of these texts. In Suisin Farr's story, we feel the pain of the mother who waits in anguish for the return of her son. But we can only imagine the effects that the tragic circumstances will have on her child. The effects of displacement on children are also something to be keenly addressed. Jamaica Kincaid's Lucy is an especially pertinent example of the ways in which being removed from one culture and implanted into another affects children. Lucy recalls a poem about daffodils, flowers she would never see in real life until she was 19 years old. A poem she was forced to memorize at Queen Victoria Girls' School when she was 10 years old. Consequently, as an adult, Lucy lacks the capacity to enjoy with her American host, or the woman she works for, Mariah, the beauty of the daffodil flower. Instead, having remembered this terrible moment when she had to memorize a poem about something she'd never seen before, something that was not native to her Caribbean, she's reminded instead of conquests and roots. She feels sorrow and bitterness when she sees the flowers for the first time in New York with Mariah. And it's become emblematic of what she's lost rather than what she's gained. For Lucy, this beautiful yellow flower is wretched. Her impression of a flower that Americans typically find beautiful is, to say the least, less than beautiful. And this difference becomes symbolic of the multiple ways in which her worldview differs from those of the people around her in the U.S. But while Lucy is alone, she's an au pair for this family, in dealing with their new surroundings, other characters in other stories, such as Tristan Brodsky in Adam Mansbach's The End of the Jews, navigate their new surroundings as part of a family. Tristan is the teenage son of Jewish immigrant parents who focus all of their efforts on ensuring that he receives an education. While playing stickball in the street, Tristan hears German and Yiddish being spoken, languages that are not his own. However, his father refuses to teach him German, even though he speaks it himself. And his mother laments Tristan's choice to take a college literature course rather than something useful, such as a class in the field of law. Mansbach's narrative, set in 1935, highlights the generational divide that is commonly experienced by immigrants and their children, but it also reveals how critical it is for the displaced person to receive an education if he or she wants to fully assimilate into mainstream American culture. This is especially important because it also highlights the ways in which the legacy of exile can be passed down to the children and grandchildren of immigrants. traumatic past hovers in the background of each of these narratives, but each text deals with trauma or collective tragedy in a different manner. Some texts deal more implicit or explicitly with it than others. In Anya Ulinich's Metropolis, two young girls discuss the slaughter of Jews at Babi Yar, which claimed the lives of some of one of the girls' family members over ice cream cones. This conversation comes just after one in which the girls refer to matzah as Jewish crackers. In these narratives, it's not uncommon for traumatic moments to be revealed in the context of mundane conversations and activities, such as eating an ice cream cone, or, as in the case of Edwidge Danticat's The Jew Breaker, looking at Christmas lights or nativity scenes. Through these stories and so many others, we learn the language of exile and displacement. The concepts themselves are universally shared, but the experiences are unique. Each story of exile shapes our understanding of the concepts in a particular way and thus contributes to a developing lexicon. Some stories, such as Geoffrey Eugenides' Middlesex, return to an ancient language to tell a very modern story, offering a powerful example of the universality of the displaced subject. In the book, the Greek immigrant family suffers considerably, afflicted by a curse, yet inextricably bound together by ecstasy or ecstasis, literally a state of displacement. The Spanglish of Junot Diaz's Drown contributes as well to a language of displacement. In his struggle to adapt to his new life in New Jersey, Junior, the protagonist, his streetwise narration reveals a particular understanding of such American concepts as freedom and hope. Being transplanted into a new culture, a new world, does not always guarantee a fresh start or a new beginning. The immigrant is often haunted by the past he or she wishes to shed. In conclusion, each of the narratives I've briefly discussed here helps us examine the aesthetics of the condition of exile and displacement, showcasing great literary writing on this theme. I'm aware, of course, of the limitations that I've presented to you tonight, and I don't mean it to be exhaustive. By introducing the theme in this way, I hope to encourage you to seek out and read the original text and to pursue additional texts in the subject area. I hope that engaging with the literature will show the ways in which the exiles' search for identity and home is a universal search, and will reveal the value in knowing their stories for the present and for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Olewicki. Wonderful, absolutely wonderful. I don't know why I didn't think to have you here before. But I hope that it's not the last time. Dr. Lewicki agreed to take a few questions. And while she has a sip of water, I will remind you about our event on Thursday, tell you a little bit about it, so you can come back and enjoy Dr. Lewicki along with some other colleagues. Given the context of her presentation today, and we knew approximately what she was going to talk about, Dr. Sutton, Dr. Gillespie, and I, in collaboration, organized a panel on engaging the globalized world, because that's what Dr. Lewicki is doing through her reading of texts in her classes and in her own research too, and subtitled it Studies Abroad program. The panel will be on Thursday at 3:30. It will be moderated by Vice Provost Dr. Meredith Newman, who is the Vice Provost of Faculty and Global Affairs. And in addition to Dr. Lewicki, we will have a professor Professor of Chinese who takes students to China every year, and that's Professor Mali from Modern Languages. We also will have the director of the Exiled Studies, that's on my mind, of Study Abroad program at the university, Dr. Laura Botan, and we will have the associate director of the Latin American Caribbean Center,
Liesl Picard.
Liesl Picard, right, I'm sorry. Liesl Picard, who,
in Argentina and Haiti.
right, mostly to Haiti, she takes her students, but also Argentina. So we have a wonderful panel that we will continue the kind of discussion that Holly Levitsky engaged in today and continue this discussion. And now, the questions. Yes, Rosa.
In the text that you mentioned today, or in any text that you've come across for exile literature, in what ways do you feel an inherited sense of exile manifests itself within following generations?
Well, mostly what I see is through trauma. So I look at it through a kind of psychoanalytic lens. And they say, my other field is the Holocaust. So I often use that as a benchmark. And, psychologists say it takes something like 6 generations to really kind of disperse out of a family those kinds of traumatic experiences. And so I can see both the next generation, what we call the second generation, third generation. I'm not seeing too much farther than that. Really, the effect is, and I can again speak mostly about Holocaust survivors, there's often an overcompensation by children of the loss that their parents experienced. And also a concomitant sort of trauma, but the trauma seems to be articulated in this kind of, I'm going to achieve what my parents weren't able to achieve, or I'm going to create because my parents lost. So there's this sense of compensating for, their parents' loss and pain. But then, and I've only studied up to the 3rd generation in the Holocaust, and I do, as I said, apply a lot of that to my work in general in exile studies. 3rd generation, like if your grandparents, let's say, were Holocaust survivors or survivors of another trauma, tend to be more angry and activists and really want to use their voice because they're not the ones who had to witness, their parents, the experiences their parents brought to the raising of a family. You just hear the stories, not seeing the symptoms themselves. And I think it's going to, as I say in here, I want to consider every story of exile a unique story. And many of the stories I'm talking about in here wouldn't necessarily, the survivors or the immigrants or refugees or exiles wouldn't necessarily fall into that category, but I can think of some would, like those from the Sudan, let's say, or other genocides or extreme kinds of violent situations like that.
First of all, thank you for being here. Just listening to you for this past hour has helped me to understand my parents' experiences as immigrants.
Speak up.
Sorry, you want me to start over? Just thank you again for being here. But I guess my question lies in policy and in your research, and what kind of government policies have you found from the host countries like America who take in these refugees and these people who've been exiled that either help them or hinder their experiences? And how do you look at the current problem of the Syrian refugee crisis and how we should handle that as a human community?
$100 million question. Thank you for asking it. I was hoping no one would. Such a difficult situation, and if you asked me 1 week ago, I'd have a different answer than after what happened a few days ago in Paris. I don't know. I mean, I wish I could offer easy answers, and also I wish I could be more optimistic. In terms of the U.S. policy, I do teach a course called Exile and Terror. And because I'm in Los Angeles, we have many, many students who were born or their parents were born in Mexico, Central America, South America, and have come as mostly illegal residents. And in the US, we've had a history of different kinds of immigration policies, and California has its own version of that. We brought Mexican immigrants here, for instance, in the 1950s to work in the fields in California, and then we sent them back. And we've kind of got a habit of doing that, and I'm speaking mostly from my knowledge of California immigration policies. So I don't know. I wish I had an easy answer. I feel no one should suffer needlessly. It's a terrible thing to see suffering. It's a terrible, terrible thing to see homelessness. And what's happening right now, the crisis in the Middle East, the Syrian refugees trying to find a home, trying to be just like us here, breaks my heart. But I don't know what to say, because there are also those who wish us ill. So what do we do? How do we make decisions based on the knowledge both that we are all humans and we're all in this together, and if we looked each other in the eye for 30 seconds, we could never kill another person, because we've seen, the eyes are a window to the soul. How can you kill someone or hate someone if you've seen into their soul? But we don't have that advantage of looking at each one of these refugees in the eye. And so I don't know. No, I hope that some of you here, as you grow into professionals in your field, can help us find some answers to these terribly complex questions that we have in our time. I'm sorry I couldn't give you a more, thorough answer.
Yes, Dr. Levitsky, you had mentioned in your discussion here a little bit about an aesthetic of exile and exilic narratives. I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit, and especially maybe how, if you see any ways that those aesthetics might influence the readers also of these narratives.
Great question. They've all been great questions. Thank you all. So by aesthetics, I mean really the way something is shaped for our pleasure. So when we read, we look at the text as something that gives us pleasure, something that we're drawn to entertain us, even though it may also enlighten us, educate us, teach us something. I call Holocaust literature, for instance, the aesthetics of agitation, because good Holocaust literature will really agitate you. You can't know that trauma unless you're agitated. You can't know it in a peaceful, complacent way. And again, I see that in a lot of the aesthetics of the exilic literature, though not all of it, because it's not all coming from a place of trauma. As I said, the themes really run the gamut. So, there's also themes, for instance, in Middlesex. I don't know if any of you know Jeff Eugene's amazing epic novel of this Greek family. Well, the trauma that begins that story is incest. I mean, it's the extermination of the ancient city of Smyrna, but it's also incest. Brother and sister marry one another. They give birth to a generation, and that generation gives birth to a generation. And the narrator, a hermaphrodite, as a result of this genetic situation, narrates his own story through that particular feeling of exile from his own sexuality, from his own, gender identity, and so on. But I think for me, the aesthetics of exile literature in general, there is no uniformity to it. I could say that about Holocaust literature, again, because the trauma is very different there. For these texts, I'm looking at something that really excites the reader. And sometimes that's form, and sometimes it's language, and sometimes it's really point of view. Some of the more interesting points of view in these stories really help me see that exilic experience in a way that I wouldn't if it were simply, a conventional point of view, something that takes us a little bit off center. And I think off center is perhaps for me, the most valuable way to look at all these stories. We're we're not talking about centralized experience. We're not talking about conventional experience. So I think anything that sets the reader off-center, from agitation on the one end to simply a kind of skewed point of view, something we're not used to the other end, and that also gives us great pleasure as a reader, is how I looked at my collection.
Thank you.
Let me ask you a question. Oh, there is one question. Yeah, go ahead.
I thank you for being here, and when my daughter said she was going to take this program, I'm thinking, Exiled, I did this. What are you going to study that? It didn't make sense to me. And as I hear you, all those stories have just stirred things in me that I guess I came here from Cuba in 1969 in the freedom fights. And I saw the pain of my parents having to say goodbye to their parents and never being, knowing they would be back again. And I think you kind of put those things in, and you put it away for a while. You want to deal with a lot of that stuff. And some of sad stories, funny stories, and I never thought of this as special thing, as a study. Right now, I am an adjunct at Miami College. I teach Exiled, and I see the stories every single day. And now, what you were saying, I'm realizing that everyone has got a story. And as thankful as the rest of this country to be able to be here, there is a pain and joy to be able to be here, and a process to adapt to a new culture, and thankful for you studying it and for this program.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let me ask you a question while some other people think of more. As a student and teacher of Holocaust literature, you probably hear many times people referring to other phenomena as Holocaust. In other words, there is it's kind of a tendency towards the study of comparative suffering, which I don't like myself to do. But one can understand that one wants to use this phenomena as metaphors. And when you talk about exile, that also happens quite often. People talk about exile, which is not the kind of exile that you talk, exile as banishment in the classical form. How does one deal with this kind of a tendency, the desire to be part of that experience? Some of it we see and we study, because we study, for example, Tsukiyama's novel that deals with leprosy, and so we talk about exile and disease. So in other words, Solzhenitsyn's The Cancer Ward, the same kind of phenomenon. How does one deal with these kinds of issues? How do you deal with your students who inevitably bring up these kind of issues?
Yeah, thank you. I don't buy that the Holocaust stands for anything but the Holocaust.
Right.
So first of all, I just heard someone the other day use it as a metaphor for something, and all I would say is the hackles go up on my neck. And the Holocaust, or the Shoah, is an historical period. It's defined by a number of authorities as having been a certain thing at a certain time. Exile, on the other hand, strikes me as a word you could open the dictionary and you could find a very broad definition of it. And so in my talk and when I teach my class, I try very hard, as I hope I expressed tonight, to look at it as an individual story each time. And also that it can be metaphorized. It can be talked about in a way when we say, for instance, transgender people, people with other sexual, gender, I don't want to say confusion because that already situates it a certain way, but you can be in exile from the mainstream situation, from the mainstream world, from something that you find yourself in some way unable to go along with the flow. that's why when I talk about exile and displacement and teach my class, I always want to talk about it through what I know, because I don't want to talk about somebody else's exile. And what I know is I'm a United States citizen. I was born here. I have seen many friends and, of course, in older generations, families come here as immigrants or as exiles. And so I could talk about that experience, and even as they have tried to kind of make themselves American, I stand on the other side of that, and to me it seems like a push-pull. And I'm not sure I'm making myself clear here, but what I like to think about is, in this word, exile and displacement, so that the one is a leaving and the other is a coming. And so I only really work in coming to the U.S., something I know and something I've seen. And, so it's like a push-pull, I guess, is my answer for that one.
Well, here we discuss many different kinds of situations, not only coming to America, but also exile and return and so on. But one of the greatest pleasures of teaching at FIU, and I hope one day you'll come and visit us as a teacher too, maybe for a semester, maybe for more, who knows, is the greatest pleasure is when you walk into a classroom, you have as many stories as you have students there.
Yes.
Because Miami is truly a city of exile, so inevitably a lot of thorny questions are coming up that you need to deal with. In addition to the terminology, because we have to clarify different categories, exiles and immigrants and expatriates and so on.
And in fact, I was just thinking about what I do with my students, because you'd ask me my students. So most of your students here, the exercise I have my students do, their big project, it's a freshman class, and it's a seminar. All students have to take this freshman seminar, different topics depending on the professor's specialty. So in mine, Exile and Terror, they have to do an ethnography of exile, is what it's called. And they have to go into their own family. And that's why I say, for me, it's very important that the displacement to the United States is one side of the formula, because all the students sitting in my classroom are in the United States, even if they are there only temporarily and going somewhere else after they graduate. And so I asked them to find someone in their family who was an exile or an immigrant. And often, and again, this is California, so we get a lot of immigration from Asia, we get a lot of immigration from South and Central America. And they say, inevitably, oh, nobody in my family is an immigrant. And I'm looking out at these faces, and they're every color in the rainbow. And I'm thinking, is this what the Founding Fathers group looked like when they first settled here a couple hundred years ago? I don't think so. So, I asked them to dig a little deeper. And what we end up doing usually is a workshop, and I'll put students in groups and ask them to just interview one another a little bit about their families, going back as far as they need to. And I did have a student, Oscar King IV, a few years ago, and Oscar was a white student, and Oscar swore to me that he had no immigrants, no exiles in his family, nobody. They've always been in the United States. He didn't look Native American. So I said, why don't you do some research in the library? Look at your name, do some research, ask whoever you can, just go spend some time in the library. It's not going to help us to interview you. So Oscar King IV, it turns out, is the great grandson of Adolf Berlitz, his first name. Does anybody know about the Berlitz language schools? Do you remember that? Some of us a little bit older maybe. Berlitz language schools. He was a German immigrant. He was Jewish, but when he came to the U.S., he hid his Judaism and eventually became associated with Christianity and started this great language school. And so not only did Oscar find out that he did have an immigrant whose family from Germany, but that he was Jewish. And it just flipped him out. I still see him on campus. He's a senior now, and he just looks at me and he just points at me. What did I do to him? But the assignment produced some miraculous material. Really, another student I had from Cuba, his parents were from Cuba, and his parents had never talked about their experiences before. And so in interviewing them, he not know existed before he questioned them. And it was, he's not pointing at me, but I know that for him this was a very significant experience, learning about his own past.
Now Oscar will be talking about trauma.
Yeah, that's right. You
Not
will.
enough that he is a student, he is a tutor. Then he have enough trouble.
Yeah, lots of cooking, of course, quite a future.
More questions? Yes.
I know you spoke about after post 9/11, a lot of people have to hide their, feel like they have to hide their nationality or identity or religious affiliations. Do you do a lot of study on identity itself? Let's say second generation Americans that I feel personally like I have to do this all the time. If I go outside of Miami, it's a different story. If I go to North Carolina, it's not the same already. I'm originally from LA, so LA to Miami is not huge for me. But after that, I joined the military and I've been around different parts of America, which I've noticed I've had to kind of do that same thing, kind of hide my own identity as well. And so I don't know through those through your reviews, come across a lot of it.
Absolutely, and that's absolutely one of the ways that second generation immigrants, exiles identify is often, as I started out by saying, try to bury not just the immigrants but the children, try to bury those memories or bury that history, and it's a very difficult thing to do. You don't want to try to bury your history, bury your past, because it will inevitably resurface somewhere, even if it's late in life, I think. And so I think we have these dual, you have a dichotomy there. You have really those who want to assimilate and be as white as possible, be part of, I don't know if we even are. Are we a white country? I don't think we even are anymore, not in LA. So you have that side of it, and then you have the side that is proud. And I think a lot of it has to do with the situation of one's parents and one's family coming here. It has a lot to do with the idea of shame. It has a lot to do with one's own personality. What do you identify with? Do you, for instance, I have students bring food the last day of class, so I ask everyone to bring some food from their ethnic background, whatever it is, in the same class. And I get some of the most interesting things. I mean, I'll have, I've had students who, maybe 3 or 4 generations earlier had come from, her family had come from Germany, and so she brought those little German eggs with, little chocolate eggs with candies in it, and I asked them to talk about it, like before we eat, could you stand up and talk about it? And she's like, well, I don't know. My grandparents used to give them to me, and they're really good, and they have a toy inside, a Kinder toy or something, or Kinder chocolate. But I've had other students who were from South America or Mexico, Central America, and they bring tortilla chips and salsa. Well, tortilla chips and salsa, last time I looked, are in every restaurant in the U.S. And I'm grateful for whoever brought them here first, and guacamole, I might add. But as far as I know, pretty much every restaurant you can go into in LA, you're going to get those, and they don't feel ethnic to me. But in terms of how you feel as a person, I think so much of that depends really on the stories that you were raised with, whether you were believed, whether you were taught to believe, to have pride in that past, or whether it's a past that you're trying to hide. And I urge you to, if you can handle like a 500-page novel sometime during your studies here, take a look at Jeffrey Eugenie's Middlesex, because to me that's a really fascinating example of a story trying to hide a very dark secret about their past. And as I said, trying to hide it, trying to suppress it, really made it rise in that much more of a ferocious way to harm the family. And of course, it's a metaphor in some ways. In other ways, it's a reality. That which is repressed tends to come back. The return of the repressed is what Freud told us to all be aware of or be wary of. So I think it has a lot to do. My feeling is it has a lot to do with the stories
I read or, I'm kind of feeling like I'm in that push-pull thing that you're talking about earlier. So, I'm probably lost.
Do you know what, and again, for me as a teacher and a scholar, I read, you know, I think any of us here, students too, you just read, you read as much as you can. And, I have a textbook coming out on exile and displacement, and, I encourage you to maybe take a look at that and read through these stories, read through any anthology. There's another anthology called Crossing the Water, which came out maybe about 10 years ago or so, and those are stories of immigration from, again, the South and Central America, to the U.S. But in all of the stories, you learn how there are similarities. You know, there's a lot of differences. Each story is unique, but as we build, as we read more and more of these stories, I mean, if you turned around and asked 10 people tonight, tell me your story, or tell me the story of someone in your family who immigrated here, you feel a lot better because you realize how similar the texture of that story is. The names are different, the places might be different, but the texture is so similar, and it's so comforting to know that other people have experienced that. So that's what I urge you to do, read more, even if you read a lot.
And that's very close to what you said earlier, looking into someone else's eyes.
Yeah.
Because that's the act of reading. Literature particularizes the experience. And suddenly, you can look into someone's eyes through literature, in this case, the exile literature displacement.
Literature is a window to the soul.
That's what it is. Yes, one more question.
What middle sex, what was Jeffrey's last name?
Eugenides.